Anytime anyone criticizes Darwin's theory of evolution, evolutionists immediately cry, it's about religion.
Well, the claim that all skeptics about Darwinian orthodoxy or Christian fundamentalists stands refuted by me. It's obviously not true. I'm neither Christian nor a fundamentalist. But lots and lots of people are skeptical in the scientific community.
I became skeptical of Darwinian evolution early on, outside of any religious influence, just because of the complexity that I was learning about in the cell, and we use the word elegant in genetics.
The biggest impasse confronting evolution is the incredibly complex structure of the living cell. Every living thing on Earth is made up of cells 1/100th of a millimeter in size. Some living things are made up of a single cell. Yet even these single-cell organisms are remarkably complex in their composition. They have complicated functions to survive, and even little motors to move. In Darwin's time, this complex structure of the cell was unknown. With the primitive microscopes of those days, cells appeared to be little more than featureless stains.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm.
The greatest advocate of Darwinism in Germany, Ernst Haeckel, supposed that the living cell, which could only be viewed as a dark spot under the microscopes of that time, had a very simple structure. In one of his articles, he referred to the cell as a simple little lump of albuminous combination of carbon.
However, powerful electron microscopes invented around the middle of the 20th century began revealing just how complex and organized it was.
With the hard work of science in the 20th century, we've seen that the cell is far from simple. It's got very complicated molecular machines and things that are very resistant to Darwinian explanation.
Cell may be the most dynamic. It is one mass of activity going on, bringing information out from across the cell, opening doors, closing doors, motor molecules moving along tracks. It is probably one of the most dynamic physical systems in the universe.
Not even the most sophisticated laboratory has been able to produce a single living cell from non-living matter. Indeed, this is fully acknowledged to be impossible, and efforts to produce living cells from non-living matter have been abandoned. But the theory of evolution claims that this system, which man with all his intelligence, knowledge, and technology cannot succeed in reproducing, came into existence by chance.
Fred Hoyle, a famous English mathematician, expressed the impossibility of formation of higher life forms without a creator. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged by chance is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from materials therein.
The ingredients must combine. But they must combine according to an exact formula in a unique way. the living molecules in your body that have protein, enzymes, DNA programming in them, the very simplest, is made up of many hundreds of components. So 100 components would have one chance in 100 million billion chances of being correct. But you see, the 100 components actually also have 4 chemical elements in each one. and really the simplest living cell that can replicate itself has 400 components. So now we've got 4 times 400, which is 1600. So we've got 1600 components, and that would be, well, 1 in 167,636 zeros following. That would be the odds against such a right combination. And wait a minute. Oh, you say, but that's a very rare thing, those kind of cells with those components. Do you know what, my dear brother and sister? You have a brain with 10 billion components.
Modern biochemistry has also revealed the unimaginably complex design of the DNA molecule. The structure of the DNA molecule was discovered by 2 scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, in 1955. Their discovery demonstrated that life was much more complex than anyone had previously envisioned. Himself a confirmed evolutionist, Francis Crick, who received a Nobel Prize for this discovery, came to confess that a structure like DNA could never have emerged by chance.
Think of a cell as being a nanofactory, a factory where, on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the 2 helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make protein. We have information in a 1-dimensional form that provides the information for a 3-dimensional form.
If we attempt to write down the information in the DNA, this would take up approximately 1 million pages. This is equal to an encyclopedia 40 times bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is one of mankind's greatest single accumulations of information. But this incredible information is stored in the tiny nucleus of our cells, measuring about 1,000th of a millimeter in size. It is calculated that a DNA chain small enough to fill a teaspoon has the capacity to store all the information contained in all the books ever written. Of course, such an amazing structure could never have been. The theory of evolution, which sees life as the result of mere coincidences and haphazard happenings, is helpless to explain anything in the face of the incredible complexity of DNA.
The information that is stored in the DNA molecule is pointing back to a designing intelligence. Now, why do I say that? It has to do with what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Our local hero in Seattle, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark because we know that programs always come from programmers. And in fact, we know generally that information, whether it's in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or in a headline in a newspaper or a block of text in a book, information always comes from an intelligent source. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, the most logical thing to conclude is that it, too, had an intelligent source.
Now, Dr. Werner Gitt is an information specialist. Since we're talking about information, will go to an information specialist. He wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information that you and I both love. And in his book he says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. Right. He goes on to say, there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Right. Now, do you realize what a serious problem that is for the evolutionist? It's a tremendously serious problem. Here's an information specialist saying that information never comes from naturalistic processes. It always requires intelligence.
A living cell is comprised of thousands of tiny parts that work in harmony. To make a comparison, within the cell, there are power stations, high-tech factories, a complex data bank, huge storage systems, advanced refineries, and a seemingly conscious cell membrane that controls what enters and leaves the cell. In order for the cell to survive, all of these organelles have to exist at the same time.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
Without the tools to observe the machinery of the cell, and long before the idea of irreducible complexity, Charles Darwin offered a way to test his own theory. In Origin of Species, he wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down."
Darwin acknowledged that if someone identified a biological system that could not have been constructed in incremental steps over long periods of time, then his theory would be invalid. And what Michael Behe and others have discovered is the existence of biological machinery that cannot be explained away by Darwinian processes. Darwin's failed predictions have in fact falsified his own theory. Falsified his own theory.
Darwin proposed that all species evolved successively from a common ancestor. But how did that first living thing come into being? Darwin did not address this question at all in his book. He was not even aware that this point was one of the biggest refutations of his theory. The primitive understanding of science in his day assumed that life had a very simple structure. According to a theory called spontaneous generation, which was popular since the medieval age, it was believed that living things could easily arise from non-living matter. It was commonly thought that frogs spontaneously arose from mud and bugs from food leftovers.
In medieval times, for instance, the scientific world was convinced that vermin and flies were generated directly from rubbish dumps or garbage. In fact, the belief was so strong that in 1668, the celebrated Italian scientist Francesco Redi had to demonstrate by means of a simple experiment that vermin and flies breed in garbage, they don't come from it.
And in Darwin's time, the belief that microbes could emanate easily from non-living materials was very common. But 5 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur scientifically refuted these myths that lay ground for evolution.
After lengthy studies and several experiments, the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur refuted the foundation that lays ground for the theory of evolution.
Can matter organize itself? No. Today there is no circumstance known under which one could affirm that microscopic beings have come into the world without parents resembling themselves.
The first evolutionist to take up the issue of the origin of life in the 20th century was the Russian biologist Alexander Oparin. His aim was to explain how the first living cell, the alleged common ancestor of all living beings according to the theory of evolution, could emerge. In the 1930s, Oparin formulated a number of theories to show how the first living cell could arise from inanimate matter by chance. However, his efforts ended in failure, and Oparin himself had to confess. Unfortunately, the origin of the cell remains a question that is actually the murkiest aspect of the whole theory of evolution. Evolutionists that followed Oparin conducted experiments to find an evolutionist explanation. The most famous of these experiments was conducted by the American chemist Stanley Miller in 1953. Miller obtained a few simple organic molecules by triggering a reaction among gases that he claimed would have been present in the primitive Earth atmosphere. At the time, this experiment was regarded as a scientific proof for evolution. It turned out to be no such thing at all.
A few years ago, Stanley Miller did a famous experiment. He took some simple materials, some methane, some ammonia, some water vapor, zotzed them with an electric spark to simulate lightning flashing back and forth in the atmosphere of the ancient Earth, and in just a week, he got amino acids, the building blocks of protein. And that was hailed as almost making life in a test tube. And that was one I used when I used to teach evolution. But I took a look at the rest of the evidence. And there are three problems with that brilliant experiment. One, he had the wrong starting materials. Two, he used the wrong conditions. And three, he got the wrong results. Other than that, it was a brilliant experiment.
The Miller experiment assumed an atmosphere of methane and ammonia, gases that could not have been present in large amounts because the ammonia would be decomposed by ultraviolet light, and methane should be found stuck to ancient sedimentary clays, but is not. Miller also left out oxygen because he knew that oxygen would destroy the very molecules he was trying to produce. But as deep as we dig, we find rocks, suggesting an oxygen-rich atmosphere.
The Earth did not have a reducing atmosphere, say an atmosphere of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, that was suggested in the Stanley Miller experiment. The Earth never had such an atmosphere. The geology is now clear. There is good evidence that the Earth has always had oxygen in its atmosphere. Now that would absolutely preclude any evolutionary origin of life.
Miller also used the wrong conditions. He used an electric spark to combine the gas molecules. The problem is that the same spark that puts amino acids together also tears them apart, and it's much better at destroying them than making them.
The problem was the chemicals put together, the amino acids in the flask, would also be torn apart by the very spark that put them together. Miller knew that as a biochemist, and so he circulated the gases, trapped out the molecules he wanted, using a well-known biochemist trick, but that would be cheating, because you were supposed to say this is how life arose before there was any intelligent design to preserve these molecules from that destructive force. Wrong conditions. Then he got the wrong results.
The main product of the Miller experiment was tar, a nuisance in organic reactions. Trace amounts of several amino acids that make up the proteins in living things were also produced. The problem is that Miller's experiment produced both left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Only left-handed amino acids make up the proteins of life, and just one right-handed molecule prevents their production. What Miller actually produced was a poisonous brew that would destroy any hope for the chemical evolution of life.
You might say, well, if what I've just said is true, what about all the evolutionists that believe in this? Well, interestingly enough, the evolutionists would agree with me. There was a time I was at a debate at San Diego State University. I was just in the audience, but two friends of mine, Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Duane Gish, were doing the debate for the creation. At the end, someone in the audience noted, ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged this evening. We have in our audience Dr. Stanley Miller. And Gish had explained why Miller's experiment would not produce life from non-life. And so the person asked Dr. Miller, would you like to respond to what Dr. Gish said about your experiments for chemical evolution? And Dr. Miller said, no. He hasn't believed in that for decades.
Miller himself eventually admitted to the invalidity of his experiment. Every evolutionist attempt in the 20th century to account for the origin of life has ended in failure.
Jeffrey Bada, a professor of geochemistry and a leading advocate of the theory of evolution, confesses this in the February 1998 issue of Earth, one of the leading periodicals of evolutionist literature.
Today, as we leave the 20th century, we still face the biggest problem that we had when we entered the 20th century. How did life originate on Earth? How did life originate on Earth? How did life originate on Earth?
Darwin proposed a single concept as his evolutionary mechanism: natural selection. The title of his book clearly reveals the importance he gave in this mechanism: the origin of species by means of natural selection.
Natural selection was a powerful idea. Physical variations that proved advantageous would be inherited by succeeding generations. Through this process, populations would be altered, and over time, fundamentally different organisms would arise without any form of intelligent guidance.
About the emergence of favorable traits, Darwin was deeply influenced by one of his contemporaries, the French biologist Lamarck.
The French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was the first person to give a detailed account of the theory of evolution. Lamarck's theory, which was later refuted, maintained that living beings evolved from one another variations over time.
Lamarck thought that living things passed their acquired traits to future generations.
This was a form of another mistaken belief called acquired inheritance. It holds that any changes a plant or animal undergoes in response to its environment are passed on to its offspring.
In Lamarck's view, giraffes evolved from deer-like creatures. Their necks extended from generation to generation as they tried to reach higher branches for food. Lamarck also believed that if the arms of the members of a family were cut off for generations, the babies would start to be born armless after a while. Darwin, who was quite influenced by these examples, came up with an even bolder claim. In The Origin of Species, he argued that some bears, while trying to hunt in water, evolved into whales. But both Lamarck and Darwin were wrong. The laws of inheritance, discovered by an Austrian botanist, Gregor Mendel, caused Lamarck's and Darwin's assertions to collapse.
It is not surprising that Darwin got heredity wrong. So did everyone else who tried to find an underlying pattern in a surface picture that seems so random and disorderly. But unbeknownst to Darwin or anyone else, someone was busy solving this great puzzle. In the process, he laid the groundwork for the new science of genetics.
In 1866, his research was published in a scientific journal and then sent to more than 120 libraries and universities. Mendel's discovery correctly described biological reality, and yet it carried a conspicuous flaw. It did not confirm the atheist spirit of the times. For example, Ernst Haeckel completely dismissed Mendel's work, and he endeavored instead to substantiate the theory of evolution and elevated the false ideas about heredity based on the ideas of Lamarck to the status of a law. Today, false beliefs about the inheritance of acquired characters are attributed solely to Haeckel, but Darwin too was wrong.
The science of genetics that developed at the beginning of the 20th that it was not acquired physical traits, but only genes that were transmitted to subsequent generations. This discovery made it clear that a scenario suggesting that acquired traits accumulated from generation to generation and generated different living species was implausible. In other words, there were no inheritable variations for Darwin's proposed mechanism of natural selection to choose from. Subsequently, the theory of evolution as advanced by Darwin has been collapsed early in the 20th century. All the other efforts by evolutionists in the 20th century could do nothing but only confirm that natural selection had no evolutionary power.
Genetic pioneers like Carl Correns and Niels Heribert Nielsen repeatedly emphasized that selection alone doesn't create something new. It only acts as a filter, like a sieve. Just as a sieve doesn't create new tea leaves, selection doesn't create new forms of life or new species.
Natural selection is a real process, and it works well for explaining certain limited kinds of variation, small-scale change. We have lots of examples of that, in fact. Where it doesn't work well is explaining what Darwin thought it could, namely the real complexity of life. We have the finch beak, and then you've got the finch itself. A minor change in the structure of the beak versus the origin itself. These are different scales of phenomena. These are different kinds of problems. And the important problem for biology is to understand where natural selection works and where it doesn't, and why there's a difference.
Evolutionist Roger Lewin has a much more credible take on this subject. Natural selection, as the central characteristic of neo-Darwinism, can have a stabilizing effect, but does not provide the creation of new species. It is not the creative force that many have suggested.
A famous evolutionist, the English paleontologist Colin Patterson, admitted this when he said, "No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever got near it, and most of the current argument in neo-Darwinism is about this question." When it was clear that the mechanism of natural selection proposed by Darwin had no evolutionary power, evolutionists had to make a fundamental change in the theory. In addition to the concept of natural selection, they added a second mechanism called mutation. Mutations are alterations or distortions that take place in the DNA of living beings, mostly as a result of external effects such as radiation or chemical action. The theory of evolution now holds that living things are differentiated from one another and develop as a result of mutations.
One of the best known examples of a mutation affecting morphology is the four-winged fruit fly.
In opening a biology text, one will often see a picture of a four-winged fruit fly. Now, as we know, ordinary fruit flies have only two wings. The four-winged fruit fly has not only its regular set of wings, but a second set of wings just next to that. And the caption or the text will say, this is evidence for the process of evolution, that mutations affect the process of development, and you can get anomalies as interesting as a four-winged fruit fly. Well, it turns out that the four-winged fruit fly is actually a very poor example of Darwinian evolution, certainly.
There are no muscles attached to it, so the second set of wings is effectively dead. The fly is a hopeless cripple. It's kind of like having a small plane with an extra pair of wings tied to its tail. The fly can only survive in the laboratory, and it would be selected out by natural selection in the wild. So it's not a step forward in evolution. It's an evolutionary dead end. And it turns out that all morphological mutations that we know of are either have no effect on the organism at all, no fitness effect, or they're harmful.
Mutations are harmful. They can bring about small adjustments in a particular species, but no way are they able to change one kind of creature into another.
What about mutations? And other genetic alterations are cited as the mechanisms used by evolution to add genetic information. Problem, they don't. Okay? Mutations lead to a loss of genetic information.
All examples of mutations are actually loss of information, even the favourable ones. There is no new genetic information. Claimed examples of evolution in action are actually examples of variation within a kind. Antibiotic resistance, insecticide resistance, peppered moths, all these are examples of rearrangement of existing genetic information or loss of genetic information. There's no new genetic information.
Clearly, if you accept that DNA model, that DNA is responsible for coding in some way all the characteristics of an organism, whether as recipe or as blueprint, then obviously you've got the basis of a theory of evolution, a scientific theory. Changes in the DNA produces changes in the organisms, etc. Everything flows from there. And yet, an unknown secret here, that neo-Darwinian paradigm has been known to be false, unquestionably false, irrefutably false, for over 50 years. I'd say the decisive year when the evidence became overwhelming was 1954. When a guy called Tracy Sonneborn published his final paper in his research after about 20 years of research.
The information required for large-scale evolution can really not come from random mutations. The Darwinian model says that it does, but nobody has ever made a calculation to show that it does. I've made a calculation that shows that it doesn't. It's very improbable that there can be many small steps of evolution, many small changes adding up to one large change. And not only is it improbable on the mathematical level, that is theoretically, but experimentally one has not found a single mutation that one can point at that actually adds information. In fact, every beneficial mutation that I have seen reduces the information, it loses information.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
In the 20th century, the theory of evolution was refuted not only by molecular biology, but also by paleontology, that is, fossil science.
You may be surprised to know that the fundamental assumptions upon which evolutionary thinking is based are not at all confirmed by paleontology.
The theory argues that first, the unicellular living beings were formed, which then in hundreds of millions of years turned into marine invertebrates and fish, respectively. These fish later had supposedly emerged onto land and turned into reptiles. The story goes further and says that birds and mammals evolved from reptiles. For this claim to be true, there ought to have been numerous intermediary species, linking one living species to another. For instance, if reptiles truly had evolved into birds, then countless half-bird, half-reptile creatures ought to have lived at one time or another. And these intermediary creatures complete half-developed organs. Darwin called these hypothetical creatures transitional forms. He knew that in order to support his theory, The remains of such intermediate forms had to be found in the fossil record.
The fact is that after nearly 2 centuries of intense research, the paleontological evidence for evolutionary theory is not only rare, but highly questionable. The point is that if evolution had really happened, the evidence would be in great abundance and incontestable. The museums would be overflowing with fossils, clearly documenting the transitions between the various biological groups. Yet there are none. Moreover, there is no indication that the situation will change in the future. Those very few fossils which are claimed to show some kind of evolutionary link, such as the amphibians Ichthyostica and Simoria, the reptile Propenognathus, the bird Archaeopteryx, and the Australopithecine ape called Homo habilis, are very far from conclusive.
There have been a few fossils that were touted as transitional forms by evolutionists, but later turned out to be nothing of the sort. One of the most important of these alleged transitional forms was the fossil of a fish called a coelacanth. For years, evolutionists claimed that this creature, which was only known in the fossil record, had characteristics similar to those of land-dwelling animals. It had, they argued, primitive legs and a primitive lung. These evolutionists' claims about the coelacanth were advanced as a scientific fact, and imaginary drawings picturing the animal crawling onto land from water made their way even to textbooks. It came as a great shock to evolutionists when a living example of the supposedly extinct coelacanth was caught in the Indian Ocean in 1938. It was then seen that the fish was no different from the fish of our day. Contrary to the claims of evolutionists, coelacanths had neither legs nor primitive lungs. What was worse, the coelacanth, supposedly a creature readying itself to make the leap from sea to land, was in reality a fish that lived only in the deep waters of the oceans, never approaching to within 180 meters of the surface. Another alleged transitional form has been a fossil bird called Archaeopteryx. For decades, evolutionists argued that this creature was an intermediary between reptiles and birds. However, the 7th Archaeopteryx fossil, discovered in 1992, revealed that the creature had a sternum. That is, the chest bone essential for flight muscles. This proved that the animal was a perfect flying bird. The evolutionist claims about the claw-like nails on the wings of the Archaeopteryx also failed, since similar structures were also discovered in modern birds like the hoatzin. Because of such reasons, one of the foremost defenders of the theory of evolution, the Stephen Jay Gould, had to admit that Archaeopteryx could not be considered as a transitional form.
Archaeopteryx, classified today by many paleontologists as a true bird, not a reptile bird intermediary, was the first of a number of deceptive schemes promoting evolutionary ideas. Evolutionists misdated and misidentified this extinct bird, presuming it to be the missing link between reptiles and birds.
The best example of a transitional form that my evolutionary friends usually give is Archaeopteryx, a supposed link between the reptiles and the birds. Recently, another bird has been found, dated by evolutionists, to be 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. So therefore, Archaeopteryx could certainly not be the ancestor of the birds. Actually, evolutionists don't have any idea how the reptiles evolved into birds. They don't have any of these transitional forms. But that doesn't stop them. You pick up any book on evolution, and Archaeopteryx is still presented as the best evidence.
Faced with these realities made clear by the fossil record, Evolutionists directed all their attention to the claim that man evolved from ape-like creatures. 6,500 different ape species have lived so far, and the majority of them are extinct. The skulls of these extinct apes, both big and small, constituted a great resource for evolutionists on which to exercise their imaginations freely. Arranging the skulls of these extinct ape species from the smallest to the biggest, and adding some skulls of vanished human races to the series, evolutionists concocted the scenario of human evolution. The most important role of this scenario is given to the extinct ape species called Australopithecus.
I have been investigating the so-called missing link between man and ape for many years, and I have found that every single one of them simply is no link whatsoever. For example, Australopithecus, the skeleton of Lucy, this really consists only of a 40% skeleton of a not very large ape, and they have not got any evidence that it ever walked upright in any of the bones that they have found of that skeleton.
The interesting thing about that is that Lucy is shown as being distinctly human-like. She's very erect in her posture, she's got human-like hands, human-like feet. I'm not quite sure where exactly the restorers got this data from, because if you examine the paper by Randall and Sussman, which described the type species to which Lucy belongs, they said quite clearly that she had long, curved hands and feet, even longer and even more curved than a chimpanzee. Several distinguished anatomists, for example, Australopithecus, the genus to which Lucy belongs, was simply an extinct ape, nothing at all to do with humans.
Evolutionists hypothesized that Australopithecus walked upright on its 2 feet, differently from other apes. However, two world-renowned anatomists, Lord Solly Zuckerman and Professor Charles Oxnard, refuted this allegation. Simply put, Australopithecus, advanced as the ancestor of man by evolutionists, is merely an extinct ape species. On the other hand, fossils that are included by evolutionists under imaginary classifications, such as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, or Homo sapien archaic, in fact belong to different human races. When these fossils are inspected, it is seen that their skeletons are essentially the same as those of people living today. The only dissimilarities are a few structural differences in their skulls. But differences like these are to be found in different human races alive on Earth today. The famous evolutionist paleontologist Richard Leakey admits that the difference between the skulls classified as Homo erectus and those of modern men is only racial. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans.
The most important missing link of all, of course, is the missing link between an ape-like ancestor and mankind. That's the missing link that most of us are interested in. Have we found that? Well, if you listen to Darwinists, you'd think that we found lots of them. In fact, the evidence really isn't there at all. All of the fossils that have been found so far have been classified, reclassified, either as human or as ape.
If we analyze the so-called missing links, we find a trail of fraud, deception, and speculation. For example, Nebraska man was reconstructed, family and all, from an extinct pig's tooth. Piltdown man is now universally known to be a deliberate hoax, consisting of an ape's jaw and a human skull, doctored to look old.
Piltdown, a quaint village in England, was hailed as the missing link between apes and humans. It was named Piltdown Man. Later, it would be called a forgery and set off a storm of scandal.
The scientific world was in an uproar. The public was scandalized. Were monkeys being made out of the scientists?
Neanderthals were just plain people, some of which suffered from arthritis, rickets, or syphilis. Ramapithecus, Gigantopithecus, and Zyganthropus were just apes, while Heidelberg man and Cro-Magnon were completely. So, despite evolutionists' misleading claims, the missing link is still missing.
Her name is Ida. She's 47 million years old, and you're looking at one of our ancestors. She is, according to scientists, a direct relative. Ida and her descendants evolved into humans. Since Darwin, mankind has been looking for the missing link, the primate that's at the root of our creation. And this is she.
Now people can say, okay, you say we're primates, like monkeys and apes, and that we came from very simple, generalized mammals. Show us the link. The link, they would have said, until now, is missing. Well, it is no longer missing.
There is a lot of excitement tonight in the world of science over a find that scientists are saying walked the Earth more than 4 million years ago. Our chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell, has more on the female creature called Ardi, who may be our oldest known relative.
Dave Phillips is professor of paleontology at the Master's College. He discusses that among the bones that have been found, there is a great lack of articulated or complete skeletons.
These remains are almost always highly fragmentary. We don't find nice, neat, articulated skeletons. You find little teeny fragments remains, perhaps a part of a jaw or mandible. Or you might find a piece of a limb bone, or you might find a few fragmentary bones from one individual skull. When it comes to the alleged sequence of human remains said to demonstrate evolution, we find this completely wanting. We do not find the intermediate forms necessary to document that.
The only evidence at hand is generally nothing more than a few skull fragments or a tibia. The hair, skin, nose, ears, lips, or other facial features of a living being cannot be determined from its bone remains. Evolution has shaped these soft tissues, which leave no trace in the fossil, to suit the purposes of their theory, and produce imaginary reconstructions in their workshops. Ernest Houghton from Harvard University states that these drawings have no scientific value. You can, with equal facility, model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. These alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value, and are likely only to mislead the public.
Darwin wrote, "Intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not refer to finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory."
Darwin was aware that the fossil record did not contain any of these hypothetical intermediate forms. This is why he devoted a special chapter to this in his book and posed these troubled questions. Why, as species have descended from other species by fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? But as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? For instance, a 400-million-year-old shark and a modern shark have exactly the same structure. Similarly, there is no difference between a 100-million-year-old ant and a modern ant, a 135-million-year-old dragonfly and a modern dragonfly, a 100-million-year-old turtle and a modern turtle, or a 55-million-year-old bat and a modern bat.
According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading, because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion. According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading, because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion.
The Cambrian explosion is a term that refers to the geologically sudden appearance of all the major, or most of the major groups of animals at about the same time, geologically speaking.
Most geologists date the Cambrian explosion at 530 to 520 million years ago.
The Cambrian explosion is a name given to a geologic event, really, the appearance in the fossil record over a period of about 10 million years or slightly less of skeletonized fauna that includes many living phyla for the first time.
In Darwin's theory, if you think of the branching tree, Darwin's branching tree, the common ancestor down here and the different modern forms of animals up here, you would have one form to begin with, and then it would gradually diverge into slightly different forms and more different until you get the major differences that we see now. The problem with the Cambrian explosion is that all these major differences appear together at the same time, with no fossil evidence that they descended from this common ancestor.
One of the world's leading researchers of the Cambrian explosion is J.Y. Chen, a paleontologist at the Nanjing Institute of Paleontology and Geology. Chen's discoveries in the fossil beds in Shenzhen, China, have rocked the scientific establishment. According to Chen, the fossils he's found turn upside down Darwin's tree of life.
Darwin's tree reverse concept very unexpectedly. Our research is convincing major phyla starting down below at beginning of Cambrian. Base is wide, gradually narrow, so this is almost turned down different way.
One of the greatest evidences for creation is found in the fossil record. For example, in the so-called Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of a vast array of very complex invertebrates: clams, snails, jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, trilobites, and many other very complex invertebrates. But nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found fossilized ancestor to a single one of those complex invertebrates. Now that fact alone demolishes the theory of evolution.
We have no fossil evidence of the ancestors of most of the modern groups of animals. One clear exception is sponges. We do have fossil sponges from before the Cambrian explosion. But in a short space of maximum, as I understand it, 5 or 10 million years, which is a blink of an eye, geologically speaking, 30 some odd major groups of animals appear recognizable and altogether suddenly on the scene. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory.
Because Darwin wrote in The Origin of Species, if numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. Despite all these facts, these skulls are still presented to the public through the media and in some evolutionist textbooks as if they were scientific facts. In many countries, an important part of the society supposes that evolution is a proven fact. A great deal of this so-called evidence of evolution, much of which has been dismissed by evolutionists themselves, is still presented to school children in their textbooks, where they are depicted as the ancestors of man.
I think it's important to understand that most of the educational programs that are implemented in the United States stem from the National Education Association. And the NEA was actually founded by John D. Rockefeller.
You can also symbolize the structure as a spider's web, with a spider in the center and different strands, different organizations, different secret societies. The closer to the spider you are, the more elite the secret society. The further out from it you are, you start to hit the organizations that directly interact with mainstream society. Somewhere here might be the Bilderberg Group, further out might be the Council on Foreign Relations and stuff like that, which are acknowledged to exist in America. But the real deal is here, which just dictates the policy down the spider's web.
If you can look at Darwin as a theory, it is a theory that should be taught in our schools. But it is just a theory. However, in our society, in our culture, and in this nation, it has been accepted as fact, and it has been enforced in the schools. We are forced to look at one viewpoint, and that is Darwin's theory of human development out of lower species, and neglect others. And it is illegal in many places to even propose that there may be a different a viewpoint here, that we may be creatures of a sovereign God.
It is now Darwin's theory of evolution that is protected by law, with all other views being excluded. Naturalistic evolution has been enshrined in the nation's public schools as the only acceptable theory of human origins. It is protected by the courts to such a degree that one judge ruled that a school district in Dover, Pennsylvania could not even inform students that there were scientific challenges to evolution or direct them to critiques of the theory.
Unfortunately, what happens in schools nowadays, and there are many reasons for this, coming from the way they're structured, the way a teacher sees his position and all that. What a student is a huge bag in which you have to dump all the knowledge. No. What you should do is train that student to think.
They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right.
If you sat around a table and you said, right, what we need to do is we need to find some way of getting young people to see the world the way we want them to see it, so that by the time they become adults, they are completely following the reality we want them to believe in. Someone might say, well, they might not have it but you know the ideal thing? What we do is we have a system where we take children away from their parents at least 5 days a week, all day, from about the age of 4 and 5, and we have control of their minds until they're about 17, 18. That would be ideal. Well, of course, that's what happens. Yeah. It's called the education system. Yes. And it's indoctrination.
And John D. Rockefeller, I think, voiced the beliefs of this ruling elite that wants to try to homogenize our education system when he was quoted as saying, I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers. So I think the education system is not only pushing people into a socialized version of government, but also dumbing the individual down to the point to where he'll be a good worker in the factory, or he'll be a good worker in Silicon Valley. He may know a lot about but he is not going to have a classic education that would allow him to take all of the facets of the culture and the society and put it together and really form an intelligent opinion as to what's really going on and what might be in the best interest of the individual.
The brain is two halves of the brain. There's the right brain and there's the left brain, and they have very, very different roles to play, especially in personality. Between them is this bridge called the corpus callosum, which bridges the information, again, information between the two. Now, this is another picture that Neil Haig did for me recently. Symbolically looking at what the right brain and the left brain do. The right brain is out there. It's creativity. It's inspiration. It's the maverick. It's the connection to all that is. It's the greater awareness. And the left brain is about structure. It sees things in parts, not as wholes. It wants things to be structured. It's about language. And it's about organization in a physical way. It's about being what we call, though often that's not what it is, rational thinking. And both sides of the brain are necessary. If you get a right brain person, we've all met them, they're fantastically creative, but they're out on another cloud. There's nothing going on down here. But you get a really imprisoned left brain person, they can't see the connections with anything, they're here. Boom, boom. And this is the target, the left brain, the soldiers on the door. This is a key to understanding this conspiracy. The whole of society is structured to turn people into left-brain prisoners who experience reality through that version of perception. Apartness, division, I am Charlie Smith. I must jump over everybody. To succeed, I must be a success. People must say you're successful. That's my identity, that's my sense of self. And so what they do, I mean, look at the system. If you want to progress within the system, this left-brain society we live in, then you have to be very, very good at exams. You go to school, you pass exams. And what are you doing in exams? You're taking information given to you, you're putting it in the left brain, you're holding it, you're regurgitating it out on an exam paper by telling the system what it's told you to believe. If you're very good at that, you go to university. If you're really good at that, you go to Oxford University or Cambridge or Yale or somewhere. Unless you've got a few quid, in which case you go anyway, like George Bush. Anyway. And then you choose your speciality. If you're very, very good at university at passing exams, boom, 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 then you get great degrees, and then you get your speciality, and you go into being a doctor or being a scientist and being even a politician, all these people. And therefore, all these people that are in the positions of power within the institutions that control and dictate the reality and direction of society are all, by the time they get there, fully paid up prisoners of the left-sodding brain. That's why scientists can't hit most of the mainstream ones, because they're so in ear. How can they understand concepts of reality in ear? They can't. That's rubbish. I can't see it, taste it, hear it, or feel it, so it can't exist. But it does. No, it can't exist. And I'm a scientist. I'm clever. And so, if you look at society, you'll see more as the months go on. You are looking at a society designed to put the centuries across the entrance to that. We become prisoners, and that prison is the prison of the left brain. That's what it is, essentially.
Since the late 19th century, since the time of Darwin, in fact, in part because of Darwin's writing in The Origin of Species, came to accept a convention, a definition of science that excluded the possibility of design as a scientific explanation. And that convention has a name. It's called methodological naturalism. And it just means that if you're going to be scientific, you must limit yourself to explanations that invoke only natural causes. You can't invoke intelligence as a cause.
When we look at the current evidence, the evidence that keeps coming out in the media, we have to ask ourselves, is there an agenda behind it? And you have to realize these paleoanthropologists, if they're not making finds, they don't get research grants, they don't get their name in the paper, they don't get to publish. Nowadays in science it's publish or perish, and they have to have something, and when you're desperate, you've got to come up with something.
Evolution is presented to grown-ups and taught to the very young as a fact that has been verified and demonstrated for so long that it is a waste of time and even ridiculous to question it.
The only defense left to evolutionists against all these scientific facts is just one thing: propaganda. The baseless scenario of the human evolution is imposed on the public by means of imaginary drawings that appear in evolutionist publications. In these drawings, creatures with hairy bodies and simian features are decked out with overtones of human-like motifs. The given impression is that these half-man, half-ape transitional forms did live once. From time to time, drawings and snapshots from the social life of these creatures are made. These misleading drawings are introduced in a particular sequence to engrave the scenario of the human evolution on the subconscious of society.